The main story of The Last of Us takes place 20 years after the fungal apocalypse. But what happened during that time? Let's discuss what happened after the prologue and before the events of the first part of the game. How the virus took over America, how the world was plunged into darkness, and what Joel was doing all this time. Before we move on to the post-apocalypse itself, let's find out how it began. The fall of the world, as we know, started with cordyceps. We already know that this is a real fungus that infects the brains of ants and other insects. In the world of the game, this fungus actually made the jump to humans. But how did that happen? To find that out, let's look back at September 26, 2013, which, if you didn't know, would become the last normal day on Earth. Before Joel, Sarah wakes up early in the morning on September 27th, Joel's birthday. The newspaper she finds reports that a fungal mold was discovered in contaminated crops from South America, which made its way into food products all across America. While the US Department of Health was conducting an investigation and many food companies had already recalled their products, it was already too late, as the cordyceps infection had begun to spread around the world. We witness a tragic scene in which Joel loses Sarah while trying to escape from Austin. We know that there are 4 initial stages of cordyceps infection, and there are 2 ways to become infected. Runner, stalker, clicker, and bloater are the main stages, as the fungus slowly takes over the human body. In the second part, 2 more appeared, the shambler and the rat king. And although the last one was an exceptional case, we know that the infected often group together. It is believed that the first 3 stages, runner, stalker, and clicker, occur within a year after infection, while the bloater stage appears after 10 years.
That don't sound good.
From this, we can conclude that over time, new stages of infection with new mutations of the human body will emerge. Between these stages, the infection spreads either through a bite or by inhaling spores. Spores were released from the body when the fungus killed its host. The initial infection affected 60% of the world's population, and many of them either became infected or died. The number of victims continued to grow, and all attempts to find a cure ended in failure. These were the first signs of the emerging anarchy. But what happened to society? What was happening to the world between 2013 and 2033? Most of the quarantine zones established to protect the population fell. From the opening sequence, we learned that residents had to register in the appropriate quarantine zones. In the chaos that reigned all around, the government was overthrown, and power shifted to a division of the US Army responsible for the quarantine zones. This organization was called FEDRA, the Federal Disaster Response Agency. FEDRA managed the quarantine zones using rather harsh methods, identifying the infected and imposing a strict curfew, which is not surprising given the global collapse. Residents were also urged to join the ranks of FEDRA under threat of food ration cuts or even eviction if they refused. Boston, where Joel lives at the beginning of the story, was an incredibly well-guarded zone with massive walls around its perimeter and a large military presence, which allowed them to defeat the terrorist group known as the Fireflies in their region. But Boston was more the exception than the rule. In the town where we met Bill, we learned that some cities and settlements were warned about the pandemic and were able to set up quarantine zones in advance. This meant that those who weren't warned were completely unprepared and became hotspots for the spread of the infection, which is where the prologue takes place, and the city quickly fell under the onslaught of the first infected and the chaos they created. We can only assume that because of the fungal mold that appeared in South America and the southern part of North America, those regions were affected first, while the western and eastern areas, like Boston for example, had a slight advantage, but even they still had to take desperate measures to avoid total collapse. The center of Boston was bombed by airstrikes in the hope of containing the spread of the disease. We know that such aggressive measures were also used in other cities, such as Seattle. For those who managed to survive the first years, new problems began to arise in the zones. FEDRA's authoritarian approach to governance caused tension between them and the residents. And when the population began to decline, order in the zones was disrupted. Riots broke out in the quarantine zones, escalating into attacks on the military, and eventually the so-called Fireflies emerged. At that time, militias across America were rising up against FEDRA. They also hoped to find a cure for cordyceps. In some cities, for example Salt Lake City, the Fireflies managed to overthrow the military government and drive out FEDRA. But as I mentioned, not everywhere, like in Boston for instance. However, the spirit of the Fireflies manifested itself in many forms. We know that the Washington Liberation Front, or simply WLF, was formed in Seattle under almost the same circumstances. Another example is the hunters in Pittsburgh, who rose up against their oppressors with the help of the fireflies, but then turned against them, adopting a hostile way of life and, in the opinion of many, becoming even worse than Fedra. Of course, there were many groups in the US that we know nothing about, because at that time, a couple of years after Outbreak Day, all news, whether written or broadcast, completely disappeared. During the struggle and revolution, most quarantine zones fell, and if they were controlled by Fedra, they were unable to reach the same level of power as in Boston. This meant that the remaining population of America was scattered across the entire country. Some joined groups, some wandered alone, and others created their own communities, like Tommy's Town in Jackson County. Meanwhile, the infected settled just about everywhere. So, what about Joel? Of course, we can see how much his character changed between the opening scene and the 20-year time jump to 2033. Although much of his past is shrouded in mystery, we do know some details about how he became the character beloved by millions of players around the world. From his final conversation with Ellie at the end of the first part, we understand that Joel may have lost hope in life. For Joel, meaning was reduced to routine survival and protecting his brother. That's how they survived the first years after the outbreak. Joel was willing to do anything to save himself and his brother. And this philosophy of existence led them to become hunters. We know how ruthless Joel was. Throughout his journey with Ellie, we see what he is capable of for the sake of his loved ones. This is justified by the environment in which they live. Many of the attacks that the main characters fell victim to were exactly the same as those Joel himself used to carry out. Eventually, the main character and Tommy went to Boston, sneaking into the local quarantine zone. Here, after witnessing Fedra's harsh rule and being recruited by Marlene, Tommy became one of the Fireflies. In the end, Tommy left Boston for Wyoming and did not see his brother again until the events of the game. After Tommy left, Joel found himself a fitting occupation, becoming a smuggler together with his partner and possibly lover Tess. Thanks to this fun job, they were able to live peacefully in Boston until they ran into Marlene. And from there you know the rest. Ellie was born around the year 2019. Her mother dies during childbirth and she is left in the care of her mother's friend, Marlene. After some time, she ends up in a Fedra boarding school for girls where they are trained to become soldiers. Then she transfers from that school to another one, and it is there that she meets Riley. They become friends, start skipping school, and on one of these trips beyond the quarantine zone, after nearly being eaten, they manage to escape and encounter the Fireflies, where a scuffle with smugglers breaks out. Marlene recognizes Ellie and sends her back to the Fedra school in the quarantine zone, since it's safer there. About a year later, the events of the Left Behind DLC take place, which also lead Ellie to the beginning of the Last of Us story. Thank you all for watching. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like and hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. Share your thoughts about the game in the comments. See you next time, friends.